30 yards away, through a wall of tangled hedge, two German soldiers stand in an open field, rifles slung, talking low. They have no idea they are being watched. They have no idea they are already dead men, if the boy hiding in the branches wants them to be. He doesn't move. He doesn't breathe wrong. He simply waits. His name was Virgil Ossman. Back in Harlem, they called him quick-tempered, a boy who couldn't let an insult pass, who'd swing before he'd think. The army broke that habit out of him fast, or maybe it just gave it somewhere else to go. In Normandy's hedgerows, the men hunting him were some of the finest marksmen Germany had, veterans of the Eastern Front, men who'd never lost a duel they could see coming. Virgil never gave them one. This isn't a story about who could shoot straighter. It's about a boy who learned, the hard way, that the safest place in a war is the place no one is looking, and that the man who can disappear on command is far more dangerous than the man who can't. Virgil learned to read a room before he learned to read a book. Growing up on a narrow block in Harlem, he watched men who talked loud die young, and men who watched quietly live long enough to matter. His temper didn't get that memo. At 14, he broke a boy's nose over a stolen nickel and spent 3 days sitting in a precinct hallway while his mother's silence said more than any beating could have. It wasn't the last time. He fought because fighting felt like the only way to be seen, to matter, to prove he wasn't someone to walk past. But there was an older cousin, a numbers runner who'd survived 2 decades of Harlem's meanest corners without ever raising his voice, who pulled Virgil aside after that arrest. He told him something Virgil wouldn't understand for years, that the loudest man in the room is usually the first one they come looking for. The quiet ones, the ones who could disappear into a doorway or a crowd, those were the ones who made it home. Virgil didn't believe him, not really, not yet. But he filed it away, the way a boy files away things he isn't ready to use. A lesson waiting patiently for a war that would make it true. Fort Benning didn't care that Virgil had grown up reading rooms full of gamblers and hustlers. It cared whether he could hit the ground before a sergeant finished shouting the word down. The lessons came fast and repetitive, drilled into muscle memory, until they didn't feel like lessons anymore. Spread out. Never bunch up. A grenade that kills 1 man kills 5 if they're standing close enough to share a laugh. Use the ground like it owes you something. Every rut, every fold of dirt, every shadow a place to disappear into. At first, Virgil thought this was for the slow soldiers, the ones who couldn't shoot straight enough to matter. Then he watched a boy from Ohio stand up half a second too soon during a live-fire exercise and understood, with a cold drop in his stomach, that this wasn't about being good with a rifle at all. It was about being hard to find. His cousin's words came back to him in the mud at Benning. Sharper now, less like advice, and more like prophecy. The quiet ones make it home. The army wasn't teaching him to be brave. It was teaching him to be invisible. And something in Virgil, some old Harlem instinct he'd carried without naming, recognized the lesson immediately. Like a language he already half knew before anyone taught him the words. The transport truck rattled to a stop somewhere inland from the beaches, and Virgil climbed down into a country that looked nothing like the flat, open training fields of Georgia. Normandy was small fields stitched together by earthen walls thick with hedge and bramble, each one boxed in so tight a man could stand in the middle and see nothing but green on every side. No horizon, no warning, just walls. A sergeant called it the bocage, said it like a curse word. Virgil understood why within the hour. Back home, danger announced itself. A raised voice, a hand moving toward a pocket. Here, the danger was the silence itself, the not knowing what waited on the other side of a hedge 10 feet away. He thought of the Ohio boy from Benning, the one who stood up too soon, and wondered how many men this ground alone would kill before anyone fired a shot. That first night, dug into a ditch with his back against cold earth, Virgil listened to a country he couldn't see and felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with fear of dying. It was the fear of not knowing where the danger was standing, and for a boy raised to always know exactly that, this quiet, boxed-in land felt like the loneliest place on earth. Oberfeldwebel Erich Hauck had killed men on the steppes of Russia at ranges most soldiers couldn't have judged with binoculars. 41 confirmed kills, though the men in his unit whispered the real number was higher, back when the Eastern Front still offered targets that stood still long enough to earn a bullet. He'd been reassigned west with a reputation that walked ahead of him into every new command post, and for the first weeks in Normandy, that reputation held. Then the patrols started coming back short. Not from artillery, not from ambush in the way his men understood ambush, Just one man gone, sometimes two, no muzzle flash anyone could place, no body found on the American side. Houck studied the reports the way he'd once studied open fields, looking for the pattern, the tell, the mistake every soldier eventually made. There wasn't one. He walked the hedgerows himself, laid in the wet grass for hours the way he had outside Kursk, waiting for whatever ghost was picking apart his patrols to show itself. Nothing moved, nothing broke. For the first time since he'd picked up a rifle as a boy, Houck felt something unfamiliar crawl up the back of his neck in that silent French field. Not fear exactly, but its quieter, more dangerous cousin, doubt. They came up through a gap in the hedgerow that looked exactly like the kind of gap a doctrine would trust, and Virgil felt it before he understood it. That old Harlem instinct, the one that used to tell him which corner had trouble waiting on it. He raised a fist, stopped his squad cold. Ahead, across a field that looked empty in every direction, something in the light was wrong. A shadow too still, a patch of hedge too clean. His sergeant hissed at him to move, that they were losing daylight, and every muscle in Virgil's body agreed. His old self would have pushed forward just to prove he wasn't scared. He held his ground instead and held the men behind him with a single raised hand, minutes stretching long enough that sweat ran cold down his back despite the chill. Then, faint, a rifle shot cracked from the tree line exactly where he'd been staring, aimed at nothing, at the empty space where his squad would have been standing if they'd kept walking. Houck had been waiting there the whole time. Virgil's sergeant went pale and didn't say a word about losing daylight again. That night, lying in the dark, Virgil understood for the first time that the temper he'd spent years trying to bury hadn't disappeared. It had just learned, finally, when silence was the more dangerous move. After that field, Virgil stopped trusting gaps altogether. If a hedge had an opening, that opening belonged to whoever was already watching it, and he was done walking into another man's plan. He started asking for the demolition charges instead, blowing fresh holes through the earthen banks where no gate or gap suggested a man should be. It was slow, filthy work, crawling the base of hedgerows on his stomach through mud and bramble that tore at his hands. But slow and alive beat fast and dead. His squad followed, grumbling at first, then not grumbling at all once two more ambushes turned up empty, because the Americans simply weren't where a smart soldier would expect them. Word traveled. Other squads started copying it. Somewhere across those fields, Houck was noticing too. Virgil didn't know the man's name yet, didn't know his rank or his record, but he understood there was someone patient and skilled hunting whatever pattern the Americans left behind, and that someone was coming up empty every single time. There was a strange comfort in that. Lying in a ditch at 2 a.m, listening to a frustrated enemy search a field for a ghost. For the first time since Harlem, Virgil felt the quiet turning into something like power instead of something like fear. Houck had spent his whole career believing a battlefield was a conversation between two skilled men, one that ended when the better shot spoke last. This was different, and the difference gnawed at him in a way Kursk never had. He began requesting the same sector day after day, telling his captain he was close, though closeness wasn't something he could point to on a map. His men noticed the change first, the way he stopped eating with them, the way he studied hedgerow diagrams by candlelight like a man trying to read a language that refused to hold still. He gave the ghost no name because naming it felt like admitting it was more than a soldier, and Houck needed it to be a soldier, needed it to be a man who would eventually make a mistake the way every man he'd ever hunted had made one. But the mistake never came. No muzzle flash lingering half a second too long, no boot print left careless in soft earth. Just silence, and then a single American shot from somewhere new every time, as if the ghost had learned his patience and simply refused to be patient back. For the first time in the war, Houck found himself hunting something that understood hunting better than being hunted, and the wound to his pride cut deeper than any bullet had. It happened on a gray morning in a field Houck had chosen carefully, close enough to a suspected American position that he could bait movement without exposing his own men. He waited 3 hours, patience worn thin as old rope, and finally he saw it. A flicker in the hedge that might have been wind, might have been nothing, might have been the ghost he'd been chasing since Kursk stopped mattering. He fired. It was the first shot he'd taken in weeks out of frustration instead of certainty, and the moment it left his rifle he understood his mistake, with the cold clarity of a man watching a door close from the wrong side. Virgil felt the round pass close enough to stir the leaves near his shoulder, and every instinct screamed at him to fire back, to finally end the duel this German had been begging for across 3 weeks of silence. He didn't. He pressed the radio instead, voice low and steady, calling in coordinates to a battery of guns Hauk didn't know existed. Hauk had time to register the sound before the world came apart around him. Not the crack of a rifle he could have respected, but the distant, indifferent thunder of something he'd never been trained to fight. He had wanted a duel. He had gotten a verdict. Virgil came home to Harlem in the spring, and the block looked exactly the way he'd left it, which felt like its own kind of strange. His cousin met him at the stoop, older now, grayer, and studied Virgil's face for a long moment before saying anything at all. "You got quiet," he said finally. Not quite a question. Virgil didn't know how to explain that quiet had saved his life more times than he could count, that somewhere in France he'd learned to disappear so completely that men with decades of training had hunted him and found nothing but empty air. He didn't tell his mother about the field where he'd held his fire and heard a bullet pass through the space he wasn't standing in. He didn't tell anyone about the radio call, about the sound that came after it, about the strange, hollow feeling of ending a man's life without ever once seeing his face. Some nights he still froze at loud noises. Some nights he lay still in the dark, testing his own breathing, the way he used to test it in ditches outside Normandy. His temper never fully returned, and some part of him missed it, missed the boy who used to swing first and think later. That boy hadn't died overseas. He'd just learned, the hard way, that the quiet ones were the ones who made it home.